Everyone, my name is Brian McGinnis. I'm here with Lisa Dorsey and Patrick McCoy, and I'm calling the Wednesday, December 13th, 2023 Smart Growth Committee meeting to order. With that, I just want to point out that if anyone has any public comment or any comments at all, please reserve those comments to just 2 minutes. Are there any comments, suggestions, petitions by residents in attendance regarding any items not on the agenda? Seeing none, let's move to our action items. Action item A, 3A, consider solicitor attendance for zoning hearing board 1007-255 Dean Street. The applicant seeks a variance from section 112-307B of the Westchester zoning code to allow for a reduction in the median lot size per dwelling unit to allow for 2 dwelling units, and section 112-603A seeking relief from minimum off-street parking requirements.
Yeah, so this application, without getting into too much of the detail, it's currently in our records as a single family dwelling. They are seeking relief to have 2 dwelling units in there. And it is staff's recommendation that we do oppose this application. This is something that we have typically opposed in the past, given that they're trying to increase density in a dwelling unit without meeting the minimum zoning requirements. And that would be our recommendation, is to have solicitor attendance at that hearing.
Thank you. Are there any questions regarding action item A? No?
No.
We could call that a 3-0 recommendation. Action item B, approve and arrange public hearing date for the adoption of the EV Ready ordinance.
So we had this here last month. Everybody was able to see a quick draft of it. This was what Will Williams worked with this on the Sustainability Committee. We did make some changes. It went back to the County Planning Commission. We are going to take it to our Planning Commission. But the only changes that we've made, they were substantive enough that we had to send it back to the county. But the only thing that we did add was incorporating the zoning ordinance change that we had discussed last month. So at this point in time, we just want to get a public hearing scheduled for this.
And when do we anticipate that public hearing?
February what? February 21st.
Thank you.
I guess we get 6 p.m. or I guess 6:30 would be fine.
Any questions regarding the public hearing?
No questions.
Okay, any public comment? You can move that as a 3-0 recommendation. Item C, approve preliminary land development 410 South High Street.
So we do have the applicants here this evening. I'm going to really turn it over to them to provide a presentation to the Smart Growth Committee. But the Planning Commission did provide a favorable recommendation for this project as a 4-3 vote by the Planning Commission. With that, I can turn it over to the applicants to provide any information they wish and answer any questions from the committee.
Thank you, Kevin. My name is Pete Stas. I'm with Core Development. I'm one of the principals. We just wanted to take a minute. We've been with Planning Commission for approximately 9 months, so I think most people are pretty familiar with the project, but wanted to just take a few minutes to introduce ourselves because we haven't formally introduced ourselves to anyone at council, and then speak briefly about the project. Of course, you can ask any questions after that, but I just wanted to make a couple comments. The name of our firm is Core Development. We're focused on town center infill. It could be either adaptive reuse or ground up development. One thing that I think it's important to note about our company is we are long-term holders of real estate. For that reason, we're vertically integrated. So we run our own management company. along with a number of other affiliated companies. So when we're building these things and thinking about them, we're not thinking about renting them once and selling them. We're thinking about what'll happen in 5 years or 10 years with how we make our decisions on the investment. We also, work really hard to build community in the buildings and then be part of the community we're in and build community that in the municipalities that we're in. So I don't live in the borough. I live just in West Bradford, but have always been involved with the borough at some level. My daughter goes to the university. One of my daughters does. She works at the YMCA. I have another daughter that worked at Roots this summer. We have my son plays basketball at the Melton Center. We donated some money for some basketball boards there a little bit ago. So, and we do own a property. We recently bought a property at 322 North Matlack. It was an old 6-unit building on the corner of Matlack and Biddle, faced Marshall Park. Beautiful building, beautiful old windows, lots of character, but it hadn't been updated for years. So we updated it and it's now occupied and it's beautiful. So welcome to anyone who wants to see it. That's the vertical integration I spoke about. We mentioned this in our initial planning commission meeting, but I just think it's important to note our focus on town center development. The Cricket Flats was a project we finished a few years back that's in the middle of Ardmore. We won a few awards there. One is the best in American Living, which is with NAHB. And then one that we're particularly proud about is the Montgomery Award. The Montgomery County Planning Commission acknowledged as an exceptional infill project. The Planning Commission at Lower Merion and many of the folks at Lower Merion are very proud of the project. In fact, they pushed us to enter, to apply for that award. They also have a town center. Montgomery County has a town center zoning overlay that they're trying to push into different municipalities, and they use this as a model example for town center development. Just a couple of comments. Yeah, so the project is slated for 128 units. It's a luxury apartment building. The closest example to this would be Chestnut Square, if I was going to compare it to anything in town. We primarily would be renting to millennials and baby boomers. That makes up most of our renters in these buildings. We've seen a strong trend towards a lot of empty nesters and retirees moving into these buildings also. So that's, obviously we can't say we know exactly who's going to move in, but that's who's living in the buildings that we own and a lot of buildings like such. We have, you can see here, it notes on the plan, we have 148 parking spaces. 27 of those spaces are bonus spaces. All of the parking would be accessed off of Dean Street right here. And we do have 2,900, more than 2,900 square feet of public space right here, which is on the corner of Dean and High. We see that as a significant amenity to the corner. Obviously, there's a lot of pedestrian traffic on that corner. So that'll be hardscaped, landscaped, and we think it'll be a nice gateway feature to the town center.
Real quick, before you continue, you keep saying Dean, that's Price Street. That's Price.
I'm sorry. Sorry. Thank you, Kevin. That's an important thing to know. So then just a couple other comments on that. We've been in front of the Planning Commission for, as I said, approximately 9 months. this project has had a lot of substantial change to it. And just to point out a few, when we initially came to our initial plan had vehicular access off of Dean Street right here. And there was 30 some parking spots in this area here. And the number of changes I'm talking about, we made because there were, these were feedback we got from the neighbors and feedback we got from the planning commission. So that was removed. Along with that, there was retail mostly along here. All that was removed. And the issue with the retail was mainly the traffic. And when you cut back the retail, it significantly reduces the amount of traffic impact of the project. We also increased the setback off of Price Street. So this building was moved back 10 feet off of Price Street from the original proposal that we had put forth. We also are setting the building back here some to address the build-to line on Dean Street. We also, and Brian, I'm sure we'll talk about this at some point, but we also chopped a third of the top floor off the building because there were some questions and concerns about height. So we took a third of the top floor off the building. And I'm going to hand it over to Tim to just mention a couple things about, just to go through our renderings briefly so you can see some pictures of the building. Magic button there.
Good evening, Timothy Cassidy from Bernardin. So these are just a couple of perspective views of the proposed building. This is from at the corner of Price Street is coming in from your left, and High Street coming down the hill on the right. And as Mr. Stas was referencing, you'll, let's see, what is this? There's the little pointer. That's the garage entrance there. So all the parking comes in and out of this way. And this is the plaza public space area that you just saw in the plan here, and where the building's been moved over to create that space. And then this grade of the building down here is approximately 10 feet below Dean Street. So, if you've walked up and down High Street, you know that, this slopes off quite a bit down across the site. So, so the building, as you are walking down the street here, the main entry is going to be up at High and Dean, and then there's this step that comes down, and you have this entry at the corner there. So then this is the view from again, Dean Street on the right here, and then High Street going down to where I was just pointing to at this other corner down in the previous image. And this would be the main entry to the amenity lobby area to come into the building. And from the corner here down to, about this area, that is all going to be what we refer to as amenity area. So by amenity area, we mean all spaces that are common areas within the buildings that the residents can use. So that's where you have, anything from socializing spaces and recreation facilities, mail rooms, package pickup, all those kinds of services that we typically have within these buildings. They'd all be situated within that space there. And then the units up above in both directions. These are just straight on building elevations showing the building from all four sides. So the top one, again, is looking at High Street. So this is Dean Street on the right again, and Price Street on the left. Price Street elevation down here. Dean Street elevation. And then this is the back of the building. You noticed probably in the plans that there are two courtyards that were shown. The building is an E-shaped configuration in plan view. And these are the two courtyard areas here that are this kind of grayed out area just to show that they're recessed back behind. So that's really the summary. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. With that, is there any public comment or questions? Or Mr. Nagel?
Yeah, good evening, Brian Nagel, counsel for the applicant. So with that overview, as Mr. Gore mentioned, there is a recommendation in favor of approval of the preliminary land development application. At this point, we have essentially clean review letters. It's a by right project under your ordinances. And that recommendation, as Pete Stas alluded to, from the Planning Commission did not come overnight. That came with numerous meetings in front of the Planning Commission, where the Planning Commission and the neighbors requested adjustments, modifications to the plan, which my client went back and made to address those concerns. Also, based on comments from the borough's consultants, there were changes made to the plan on that basis. Several of those changes were significant, as Mr. Stas noted, the removal of the access and garage along Dean Street. With that also, there was a problem with loading a current Cisco truck that loads in the middle of Dean Street and blocks the traffic. We created a loading space that can be utilized by that loading truck and for loading for the subject building. We adjusted the building relationship to the street. There was a concern addressed in particular by members of the Planning Commission about the height of the building on the Price Street side in particular, because on that side, even though it complied with your height calculation under the zoning ordinance, you did have essentially a 60-foot height there along Price Street. And the Planning Commission didn't feel as though that met the spirit of the ordinance. We're not required to meet the spirit of the ordinance, of course, but we wanted to address those concerns. So as a result of that, an entire section of the building was removed on that side so that that height from that perspective kind of matches around the rest of the building. So at this point, we believe this is ready for preliminary land development approval, and we ask that you make that recommendation moving forward to full council.
Thank you. Is there any public comment?
Good evening. My name is Lee Stivel, and I represent many residents in the Dean, Price, and Church Street areas. I'll just take a moment or two to introduce one person who will present more substantive information. That would be land planner CJ Frederick. You've heard this evening so far that there have been significant changes. I guess they presented these significant changes that they were just doing someone a favor. But the significant changes were a result of trying to make the building compliant with zoning and subdivision regulations.
The mic down and talking into it.
Thank you. So these significant changes were as a result of bringing the building into compliance. And sitting here today, there are three significant zoning regulations that are not in compliance. And in the first respect, number one, I've never seen a project of this significance. This amount of almost an entire block being developed with so many open issues and so many conditional planning issues that are by way of recommendation from the Planning Commission. If I may hand out a proposed recommendation. Uh, Sure. So you'll see that there was an initial recommendation to not approve or not recommend a recommendation for this project. And in a split vote, that recommendation failed. And why was there an initial recommendation not to approve? Well, there are major problems still. Number one, there's an issue with regard to the build to and again, for many months with this applicant suggesting that they did not have to comply with the zoning ordinance with respect to right of way. And in the zoning ordinance, the zoning ordinance mandated or adopted by reference the right of way provisions in the subdivision ordinance. And for many months, the applicant was making the suggestion that, well, we can derive a waiver from the right of way requirements and then bootstrap our way into the zoning ordinance provision. Well, they eventually said, no, we'll comply with the right of way. So that's another example of, well, we're doing something to bring it into compliance. This is not an as-right plan as was represented. So now our next issue is the build to line, and Mr. C.J. Frederick will introduce that concept to this panel. We believe that based on their ad hoc reading of the build to provision and their implementation of lines, that they're just incorrect, and specifically along High Street as well as Dean Street. So there has to be modification of the location of the building to relate to the historical development of this district. And most importantly, another zoning ordinance that there's a failure, there's a non-compliance. That would be the height of the building. Now, we received amended height calculations the week of the Planning Commission. Mr. C.J. Frederick made calculations, and he'll present those calculations this evening. There's nothing but it's an arithmetic process. Does the height comply? And when you read the zoning ordinance and you go over the mathematical determination, it's not in compliance. Rather than having a limitation of 45 feet, the building is 47 feet, 8 inches in height. Now, they thought that, well, we reduced one portion of the building. Well, why? Because it was not in compliance, and it's still not in compliance. Now, Mr. C.J. Frederick did the mathematical computations. So did one of the Planning Commission members who was an engineer. That person also calculated, ironically, at 47 feet, 8 inches. To my dismay, my letters have not gotten to Pannoni and Associates, your engineering consultant, who would, and I'll pass out the stuff to the representative from Pannoni. Your engineering consultant should likewise do the mathematical computation. It shouldn't be left to Mr. C.J. Frederick, who is a competent land planner, or to one of the Planning Commission members. That's why you have consultants. So the height is still an open issue. And from our perspective, it is non-compliant. The next item is parking. And again, we were getting parking information right to the last week, and things kept changing. And as a matter of fact, they changed dramatically from the relinquishment of the commercial use. Now, I'm suggesting that you will see a report within the next week from a traffic planner, and you'll hear from Mr. C.J. Frederick tonight that the parking is misguided. Under the traffic manual, there are several levels or several potential target type of parking requirements that you have to meet, depending on the type of building, where the building is located, how closely the building is located to regional rail or traffic or public transportation, and in fact, whether or not there's parking around the circumference of the building. Well, what this applicant did, they picked the wrong standard. The standard that this applicant picked was the lowest standard, providing for the least amount of parking. Did not account for this building has no parking around the circumference. Did not account that there is not a significant public transportation hub within within a half mile or so of the building. Mr. C.J. Frederick will address that as well. So we believe that by next week on your workshop meeting, you will see information, hopefully from Pannoni, indicating that the height is still a problem. And from your traffic engineering consultant that yes, there's still a problem with parking. The residents aren't opposed to development. The residents are simply opposed to development that does not comply with your ordinances. And that's where we have been in this entire time. We appreciate your time and consideration, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you. CJ?
Little bit of a presentation. Anybody that wants to come and sit, I'm going to put. Because I don't have an exhibit relative to parking.
CJ, you have to come to the mic, you have to use the microphone and state your name and address for the record, please. Nobody can hear you.
I can talk a lot.
People online need to be able to hear you. Please use the
I
microphone.
didn't realize we were on. TJ, it's wireless. Just pick it up and hold it.
It's,
Okay, we good?
yes.
Okay, because I don't have a large exhibit relative to parking, I've handed you handouts that we have relative to parking. And,
Please state your name and address for the record.
okay, my name is CJ Frederick. I live at 22 Dean Street, which is immediately adjacent to the subject project. I'm a registered architect, registered landscape architect, and also a land planner with about 50-plus years of experience here in Chester County, Southeast Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. As I said, we're going to go first with parking. Parking was a very interesting subject as it evolved through the project in that it never really got any kind of heavy scrutiny in the review letters for some reason. There was some points where there was dwelling on whether or not the parking count that was projected to be provided held accommodation for guest parking. I believe that's still an open item that's never been answered in the letter. In addition, on the first page of what I've given you, you will notice the text from your actual zoning ordinance that speaks to how they generate and are to provide parking for a project such as this. You'll notice the first line makes the reference that everybody's become familiar with to the ITE documents. However, also notice that it says documents such as that you can find in the ITE. Also notice that I think people who wrote the ordinance, this is conjecture though, so don't take it necessarily as I have some inside information. But you'll notice that down at the bottom of the first page, it reads, the number of off-street parking spaces provided will be determined by the borough based on the information supplied by the applicant and such other information and studies as the borough shall determine relevant. So you have a lot of leeway as to what backup information and research you want to honor in granting the applicant approval with regard to its provision of proper amount of parking. I'll go faster with this. One of the main pivot points in doing parking and providing a parking study is on the second page. It's actually a page from the McMahon study. And you'll notice that it identifies the use that they picked to represent the applicant's project. Dense, multi-use, urban setting. Okay? And that's spelled out somewhat in ITE and in the text below. But perhaps the most significant thing is in the second piece of highlighted information that I've provided you. And then remember, this is from McMahon's study itself. It says, because the motor vehicle will still present the primary mode of travel to and from the area, there typically is on-street parking and other off-street public parking. So this application, as represented in the traffic study, generating parking and satisfying the parking requirement, is making the statement that it's heavily reliant on on-street parking in the area. The last thing I gave you is kind of an interesting piece because it's something that just came to me serendipitously one day through Vista, which I don't know how many of you get the little emails from Vista on a basis and you read the articles. This is an article about a 12-story apartment project. It's only one page of text long. 12-story apartment project in Conshohocken. It sits right next to the SEPTA transit stop in Conshohocken. Okay, so not only is it, as Lee mentioned, within 1/2 mile, it's right next to it. This project has 348 units proposed, and it has 500 parking spaces. Okay, that's a ratio of 1.43 per unit. The project that we have here is providing something on the order of 1.16. Okay, and be apprised that in the ITE manual, and a lot of this, as Lee said, will be talked about by our traffic consultant going forward. There's a table in ITE, parking supply ratio. And for uses like this, it ranges anywhere from 1.2, which is just above what they provided, to 1.7. And I'll let the traffic engineer sift through the
CJ, but so with these questions and what the attorney stated, just to sum up for time, and if we could just move it along, your questions are again about the parking,
yeah, and you'll
the
notice
height, and the build too.
right, I'm going to go to the other two quickly.
Right, because what I want to do is, since we have the consultants here, have them address those three
Okay.
concerns as well.
That's fine.
All right?
Okay, and you'll notice the planning commission in its motion actually spoke to cleaning up the parking issue and also said it wanted to clarify the process that was used in arriving at the numbers. Okay, building height I can do is relatively quickly. Jennifer, can you hold this? Okay. I'm going to give you this exhibit. CJ. Give you everything. Okay. Notice at the top, there is some highlighting again of text, which is directly from your building permits. Identifies how they is determined. Just reach over and grab it. Okay, thank you. Okay. Okay, it talks to two different kinds of buildings, buildings with flat roofs, buildings with sloped roofs. We don't need to necessarily go into the clarification for sloped roofs. But in the case of a flat roof, it says, regard to all buildings, the highest point of the roof in the case of a flat roof is measured against the vertical distance. It reads as this way: the vertical distance measured from the average level of the finished grade. Okay, what they mean by that is the average level of the grade around the base of the building. This exhibit shows it as a flat condition. It's kind of irrelevant. You can compute an average. Along the exterior walls of the building, 2, and this is where it gets interesting. The highest point of any structure which rises above the roof line and which floor area equals or exceeds 20% of the ground floor of the building which supports it. Okay? If you look at the uppermost diagram, this was basically referred to when these kind of ordinances came about to determine height as kind of a penthouse rule. It was to determine the size and height of the building according to a penthouse, which might be set back from the edges, but nonetheless be rather large and project higher. Clarification is if it's more than 20%. Although generally configured, you have something referencing flat roof, like what you recall the applicant described its building to be, where section along Price Street at the lower left has had its upper floor eliminated. But nonetheless, in calculating height, the process is exactly the same. Mean grade around the building to the high point. Okay, and those exhibits are clean. You have the charts in the second handout that I gave you, 8.5 by 11. Okay. They are actually the applicant's charts. And as I said to the Planning Commission, you can kind of eliminate the whole middle of the chart if you want, because it's irrelevant. I don't know why they did the calculations the way they did. I characterized it as basically saying you're flying to Los Angeles and heading off over the Atlantic Ocean. That's pretty much what it is. But what you look at is the fact that the highlighted area is where the applicant wants to measure only to the edge of the topmost portion of the lower roof. That's not the language of the ordinance. The ordinance is clear. If the remaining amount of building is greater than 20% of the floor area of the building, you still measure to its high point, as shown in the diagram. What I've done is I've given you those numbers. The applicant's numbers are highlighted in yellow. My addition of numbers is shown to the side. Key numbers here are, you notice that the applicant identifies a number of 432.00. That's the first floor elevation of the building. In essence, if this is Dean and High Street right here, that's where 432.00 is, okay? And the applicant identifies that that highest point on the roof is 43.5 feet above that. You'll see that number repeated in the middle column in the building. Building above first floor elevation. That's the height. So you add 43.5 to 432. The high point to this building is 475.5. I want to point out that that's never been really verified. This diagram and even my presentation in relation to it is all taking the applicant's word for it. Tom Comita's letter asked for a cross-section through the building such that this kind of thing could actually rely on hard data. That's not been done yet. I don't know if the applicant intends to do it. But anyway, 475.5 is the high point. You have to adjust the numbers that they have otherwise still only used the 43.5 and added it. That would happen here. where they decided that 43.5 should be all that they would add there. You'll notice that adjacent to the highlighted numbers, mine are numbers about 10 feet, 8 inches more than that, because you have to go one more floor in the area at High and Dean. When you do all this, I guess the best way to put it is, you get to the third page, okay? That's the summary. Okay, and you get the calculation, 47.66 or 47 feet, 8 inches high, not 45 feet. As Lee mentioned, Matt Clapp, Planning Commission member, came up with virtually the same number. I did a second calculation, which, as I said, because you don't need to do it the way they did, where I just went down the leftmost column, calculated an average finished grade around the building, subtracted it from the 475.5, and in that case, probably due to some roundings with the numbers, came up with 47 feet, 7 inches. So both methods that I used produced virtually the same result with a methodology that pays attention to the zoning ordinance language. Lastly, the Bill 2 line. And I think Lee, in fairness, represented that the applicant, and I think the applicant said it as well, the applicant on Price Street has made an adjustment. I mean, originally, these 3 yards, which are on the street, which are considered front yards according to your ordinance, originally, they all had a 0 setback. Since then, Price Street has moved approximately 9-10 feet away from Price Street at the southwest corner. Dean Street, which we represented more or less similar to the way they've presented it tonight, is now subject to being changed. We don't know exactly what that change will be, but the applicant identified that in conjunction with its withdrawal of the waiver for the right-of-way issue, that the building will be moving southward in that location, providing more. But the main thing to look at here is High Street, where the 0 setback is still maintained. And this is really simple. Of all the white lines that you see here, which represent, okay, adjacent properties, and adjacent can mean across the street, because the applicant has identified this building as the one that it thinks it only has to relate to. But you'll notice it's across the street. I agree with them. You can use it. But what you'll notice in the white lines are the Bill 2 lines identified for this area, specifically for High Street. You'll notice the scale of the building, its relationship to the street, as well as the reference building that the applicant wants to use. However, this is 4 and 5 stories. This is 1 and 2 stories. But the rules are horizontal in nature. The impact will be more significant, but it should nonetheless conform with the Bill 2 requirement. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. With that, I'd like to call on our consultants to answer some of these questions regarding the height, the Bill 2 line, and parking. So if you can do that, then from there, we'll take any other public comment from anyone that hasn't yet spoken, and then move forward with the meeting.
Hi, Kelly Goff. I'm the consultant for the parking, the borough's consultant for the parking and the traffic. So I'm going to address his parking concerns. It is our opinion that the parking does meet the ITE manual. I think that the 1.2 number that he's referring to is the supply number that past buildings have supplied, but not actually the demand. If he shows me that, I looked at the table while I was sitting there it is the supply. So unless there's another table he's talking about, I believe he's referring to the supply, not the demand. And the second point I wanted to bring up is he brought up the Conshohocken building, and I'm not familiar with the code in Conshohocken. I don't know if they have their applicants use the ITE manual or if they have some other manual or something else specifically written in their code. So I can't really comment on what he's saying about that Conshohocken building of having the 500 spaces for the 300 units. Do you guys have any questions?
Again, in your opinion, it does meet the parking requirement.
Yes.
Thank you.
Can I clarify something about that? It does meet one of the methodologies in ITE. I thought I was saying that it is close to that. However, you need to realize ITE's data is like Wikipedia. People mail it in when they feel like it. ITE therefore has a number of ways that they tell you to calculate parking requirement. And there's 4 different ways to do it. This is the one that produces the lowest quantity. The other thing about Conshohocken is its ordinance doesn't matter. The point is 348 units, 1.4 next to a transit stop.
Thank you. Mr. Klein, do you want to address the height requirements as well as the build to line, or do we want Mr. Gore to address that?
Yeah, I can start to address it here, but I will say that we did have Pannoni review the height calculations that were provided by the applicant and height calculations that were done by Mr. Clapp from the Planning Commission. The ordinance, the language in the ordinance was reviewed by myself, the solicitor, and Pannoni. And the 3 of us are in agreement that the way it's being interpreted and the way the applicant has provided those height calculations and determined the 45-foot average height is correct. And the math that Pannoni checked, provided by the applicant, is correct. And Nate can provide more information on what they looked at in the office, but we are confident that that information is accurate. And if you want to continue to discuss that, if you want Nate to provide any additional information, feel free. Or if you want me to address the build to line, I can.
Can you tell us, Kevin, how the height calculation was done?
So the height calculations that were provided by the applicant, and this is our interpretation of the zoning ordinance. The ordinance specifically says in here that it's along all of the exterior walls. And that language is important to understand. There's a reason why they're measuring around the perimeter of the building along all the exterior walls. Because if you're going to measure around all of the exterior walls to one singular point on a building, it's going to come up with the numbers that Mr. Frederick has come up with. You're measuring an area above a building that does not exist. So if that building was stepped down along that grade the whole way, if there was another portion that was lower in the middle of the building, then you're measuring to that highest point along either Price or Dean. And it's not practical because you're measuring a building that does not exist there. So by measuring around the grade, you're measuring at that point around the grade to the highest point of the roof of where you're measuring it. And that is our interpretation of the zoning code. And that is how it has been done in the past, historically on other projects.
Thank you. And if you could address again the concern regarding the build to line.
Yeah, this has been an issue that was reviewed by myself and Mr. Comita. The build to line along, and it doesn't sound like Mr. Frederick is arguing the Dean Street or the Price Street setbacks, because those setbacks are in line with the structures along both Price and Dean. And that's what the ordinance says. It says structure, adjacent structures. This exhibit that Mr. Frederick has supplied to us, I'm not sure what it's really showing, but there's some arbitrary lines on here. The buildings that are north of the site, which I will refer to as the High Street Cafe, which is the most adjacent building. The front of the building, the proposed building, is in line with the High Street Cafe. That is the town center. That is an adjacent structure. And that is the line that they've utilized for the building setback along High Street. The Dean Street setback is in line with a structure that is on Mr. Frederick's property, which is a large accessory structure. And again, Price Street is set back to the front of the structures along Price. There's some porches there that match that setback for that frontage.
Thank you. Is there any, briefly, please?
Those lines are not arbitrary. I think if you did look at the exhibit I provided you, you'll see that they follow exactly along the fronts of all the buildings in the streets that are identified. The other thing is, about 35 years ago, when this height calculation.
Please use the microphone if you're going to speak.
About 35 years ago, when this height language came into zoning ordinances in Chester County, it's been other places before. No one has ever provided calculations like they did. They don't even match the language. I think you people are way smarter than that to just read the language of your own ordinance and realize it has nothing to do with what you just were told.
Thank you. Is there any further public comment from anyone that did not yet speak? All right. And any comment from my colleagues? Any questions up here? Oh, yeah, please approach the mic. Thank you.
Cheryl Kiley, I live at 511 Price Street. And this is more a comment, and forgive me if I don't totally understand the process of the traffic study. I need to read it even deeper. But I want to put some common sense behind the traffic study. And I'd invite all of you to go to the Burger King parking lot tomorrow morning during rush hour or tomorrow afternoon during rush hour and see if you can turn out onto Price Street in that time. Because I live on the 500 block and I cannot pull out of my driveway in rush hour. And that is a much different traffic than on the Burger King lot. So as we're talking about however many parking spaces, and then the fact that there is absolutely no street parking and no overflow for this building, I have no idea how they're going to come and go out of that parking garage because it's already a mess. So I would encourage the traffic study. You can put anything you want on paper and you can work the calculations and you can make an algorithm work. But what is the reality of living with that algorithm after it's built? That's what I want you to ask your experts.
Thank you. With that, I think we've already heard from you.
Wait a second. I haven't had an opportunity to address any of these points that were raised by Mr. Stivel and Mr. Frederick, anybody else who spoke. I'd like to briefly address them.
If you could be brief, and then we're going to discuss this real quick and then move on. Thank you.
And I will be brief. Brian Nagel, counsel for the applicant. I want to just debunk the suggestion that changes were made to meet ordinances. The project, there were some changes made in response to comments, but most of the major changes were changes that were voluntarily made by my client based on the feedback from the Planning Commission and the neighbors and the consultants, even though we already complied with your ordinances. The right-of-way waiver was voluntarily removed. That waiver has been granted, I believe, on every project that has a parking garage that's been built in the borough, as long as I've been around. The build to line, there was never a zero setback on this project. That is not accurate. And as that was stated, that meets your calculation. And do you have the the one height exhibit that you could put up. The purple, one with the purple. Essentially, what happens with the calculation that Mr. Frederick is suggesting should apply, you're measuring the very section of the building that the planning commission asked my client to remove so that the spirit, the look of the height of the building was more in keeping with their expectation rather than what's required to meet the ordinance. So that's also was a voluntary change. And if you calculate it the way they calculate it, essentially you're measuring the air in that section of the building, which is indeed, if you interpret the ordinance that way, it's a ridiculous result. And the law doesn't allow for that. The parking has been stable on this project for 6 months. There's bonus spaces in the garage. There's extra spaces above the requirement in the garage. So a suggestion to the contrary of that is not accurate. The ITE, the parking isn't determined based on articles. It's largely determined based on ITE in a lot of places. The ITE is the generally accepted standard. That's why it's in your ordinance. That's why it's referenced in your ordinance. And that's why it was used in the calculations here by both your consultant and the applicant's consultant. So I would again request that the recommendation made to approve the preliminary land development plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comment, Ms. Dorsey?
Someone in the,
Thank you. My name is Gunnar Mossbod, 401 South Bradford Avenue. I just want to say, it really doesn't matter what's happened in the past. In the past, we were a different borough. We're bigger now. We have more complexities. And we have more issues to deal with. That should not be an issue. But what I will say is there seems to be so much that is in question from professionals in their fields that I don't think any of the members of the community are against this project. We're against a behemoth size of this project. And it needs to follow code. So I hope that you guys will send it back and until the codes are actually met. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, any other public comment? All right, seeing none. Ms. Dorsey, do you have any comment?
no, I don't.
Mr. McCoy?
I don't know if it's a comment or a question, but what I've heard is that there are no code compliance issues according to our consultants and Kevin as the zoning officer. Is that correct? Thank you.
Yes, and since there are no compliance issues or code compliance issues, I think we should move forward with that, to move forward preliminary with this on condition. One of the conditions I want to make, and this is to the builders, is the loading zone off Dean Street, that has to be approved through our parking moving forward. Okay. Any further comment with that?
I just have a question for Ms. Goff regarding site distance. I know site distance was addressed for the access to the parking, but for the signalized intersection at Price and High, does that come into play? I know it's a signalized intersection, but it seems like that corner with a left turn or a right turn on red could be problematic. Has that been addressed at all?
They addressed all site distance requirements per the code. So the site distance requirement that they are requesting a waiver from that they cannot meet is the one coming out of the driveway on Price, but everything else they are compliant with.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you. Ms. Dorsey, do you have any objection moving forward?
No.
No.
No, we could call this a 3-0 moving forward again with the condition of the parking and loading or the loading zone on Dean Street. approved by the Parking Committee.
Members of the committee, just confirm that that includes the 4 waivers, the waivers from 4 areas that the applicant is seeking. So your recommendation to the whole of council is to approve the waivers, correct?
Yes.
And the conditions as set forth by the planning commission. And of
Yes.
And of course, council will be able to consider any other conditions that the 3 of you or any other members of council wish to discuss at the meetings next week.
Thank you. With that, let's move to item D, approve the 2023 HARB submission recommendations. Number 1, 119 North High Street. We had this come before us.
Yeah, I just wanted to give it a minute to clear out. Yeah, this one did come before us. As you remember, the applicant had come to a Borough Council meeting prior to any recommendation from the Historic and Architectural Review Board to ask for an approval, which we asked them to then go back to HARB to get that final recommendation. And clearly you can see on the agenda here that HARB has recommended denial of the application for the following reasons, which are listed there, that the existing window condition is not sufficiently deteriorated to justify replacement. The windows proposed for removal are on the building's 2 primary street facades, and the current application is based on aluminum clad wood windows. Carol Quigley, the chair of HARB, is here if you want to ask any specific questions to this application. But I did have a chance to review the HARB guidelines surrounding window replacements, and it does appear that this denial of this application is in line with the requirements and recommendations that are in the guidelines for specifically related to window replacement.
Thank you. Are there any comments?
No, we've talked about this at nauseam.
The applicant change anything since we had discussion last month?
I would direct that question to Carol. Carol, if you want to go to the microphone, answer any of those questions.
Carol Quigley, 136 West Bernard Street, Chair of the Historical and Architectural Review Board. Apologies for clerical timeliness. There are some updates to the certificate of appropriateness that's been forwarded to, to the building department and hopefully has made its way to you all, though not on the hard copy of the agenda. There were edits made to clarify the motion that I made to recommend denial of the application. So the reason number 3 is not technically a reason for the denial of the application. The denial of the application is based on 1, 2, and some more elaborate reasons that you should have in your documentation. But it is primarily that we review and we recommend approval for replacement windows more often than I would like. And that is always based on deteriorated window conditions that are beyond a reasonable repair. That is supported, as Kevin already mentioned, by the design guidelines that were written for the borough in 2004. And the design guidelines are based on the Secretary of Interior standards. The Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation, number 2, 5, 6, and 9, which were actually cited in the motion as defense for the denial, are written to support the retaining of character defining features of historic structures within the historic districts when they can be salvaged. And it's not even like when they can be salvaged. It's not like we don't expect nobody expects anybody to have museum quality architecture even in our historic district. It'd be nice, but that's not the case. We replace windows when they are deteriorated, not when they're fine or when they allow the noise of an adjacent jackhammer to disturb the interior occupants. The applicants have stated several times that the windows were deteriorated, but they've also acknowledged that no, they're not. And it's interior conditions like noise on the street, thanks to our Pico and Aqua, which we all, as residents of the borough, have to deal with, and noise on the street, and some great west-facing windows that bring in a lot of sun are not reasons for replacement of historic fabric in the historic district.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
So based on the recommendation from HARB, there are two paths forward with this application. One is that the applicant can come to Borough Council next week, now that there is an official recommendation, and they can appeal to Borough Council to alter that recommendation. Or if Borough Council denies the certificate of appropriateness, then we will send letters to the State Historic Preservation Office and Museum Commission.
May I make one further point of clarification? I think it's the reason that things were written quite a little bit incorrectly with the motion there. The application before us, to answer your question, Mr. McCoy, I apologize, I didn't do that. The applicant had initially submitted an application for the entirety of the project. The only change that was made between September and October's submission was splitting of the pieces of the project into 4 different applications for different components of the 2 sides of the building. There were no changes. There was a detail sheet that, for whatever technical reason, was never included within the electronic submission document, which is all we get. And that detail sheet identified not just that they are aluminum clad windows, which, when windows are deteriorated and require replacement, are not recommended by the HARB, but it was more further details that would never be recommended by the HARB nor supported by the building department or anybody for as long as I've known. A nice aluminum padding that would wrap the frame of the window, and then a replacement of the perfectly intact brick molds in a composite material, and then a wrapping of the wood sill in aluminum as well. So there's a whole layer of details that are inappropriate in a whole different manner of ways. So even if the Borough Council did not feel that that the language of the design guidelines, the language of the Secretary of Interior Standards was an appropriate reason for denying this application, the application before you is not one that could be supported anyway. So there would still need to be another layer of effort to get to something that was compliant if these windows were deteriorated or there was justification for replacing them.
Thank you. Are there any objections to denying 119 North Hyde Street?
No.
Thank you. 3, we call that 3-0. 39 South High Street, front door replacement.
This one, it was approved, recommended for approval with no conditions as submitted.
Thank you. Any objections to 39 South High Street?
No.
No.
Thank you. 22 North Darlington, vinyl decals on the front and both side and front window.
And they HARB recommended this for approval with just a condition, well, more of a clarification actually, that the storefront glass be clear and not opaque.
Thank you. Any objections to 22 North Darlington?
No.
Call that 3-0. And 225, 227 North Church Street, replace porch roof.
Again, HARB did recommend approval of the COA for this project with 2 conditions: that the porch roof pole gutter design will be retained and refurbished as required, and the wood porch ceiling/roof decking will be repaired in kind with matching materials.
Thank you. Any objections to 225, 227 North Church? Call that 3-0. Item E, approve the November 2023 Smart Growth Committee minutes. Any objections?
No objections.
No objections, 3-0. Any other business? Seeing none, motion to adjourn.